Now for today's program, which is co-sponsored with the Yiddish Book Center. Anita Norich is a collegiate professor emerita of English and Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. She is the translator of Fear and Other Stories by Chana Blankshteyn and A Jewish Refugee in New York by Kadya Molodovsky, as well as the forthcoming book, Two Feelings by Celia Dropkin. Anita is the author or co-editor of many books, including Writing in Tongues, Yiddish Translation in the 20th Century, as well as Gender and Text in Modern Hebrew and Yiddish Literature, among several others. Lisa Newman is the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs. She is the host of the center's podcast, The Shmooze, and director of White Goat Press, the Yiddish Book Center's imprint. Prior to joining the Yiddish Book Center, Lisa was a public relations and marketing consultant for a variety of national nonprofit and corporate clients. She has been an instructor at the Radcliffe Publishing Course and the Columbia Publishing Course, as well as a panelist at industry events. Please welcome Anita Norich and Lisa Newman.
Thank you, Suzanne. And hello, Anita.
Hello.
So this is very fun to have a chance, as always, to have a chit chat with you. So I appreciate Moment Magazine getting us together and in our respective areas, Amherst, Mass here and New York there. So I guess I'm going to jump in with this conversation by asking you if you can talk a little bit how you came to your work in Yiddish literature and translation, and maybe how the field has changed a bit since then.
I taught at the University of Michigan, as Suzanne said, and I wrote one of my last books was before I started translating was a work on translation called Writing in Tongues, and I had always heard that women didn't write novels, that they wrote poetry, they wrote memoirs, they wrote diaries, but criticism, maybe translations, but not novels, which always seemed wrong to me. I came from English literature, my doctorate's in English, which always seemed sort of suspect, but I didn't know about them. And when I started looking for them, there was a wealth there. I had seen the Kadya Molodovsky book, that first full-length novel that I translated. I had seen that when I was writing a previous book, Discovering Exile. And when I did the research, it turns out Molodovsky wrote 4 novels, actually 3.5. One was unfinished, but there was more there. And when I was writing in Tongues, I really became interested in trying my hand at translation. And I love doing it, and I can do it now. So that's what I've been spending all my time on.
Which we're very happy that you are.
Thank you.
Anita. I gobble up your books and look forward to the next one. Let's maybe also start with, the title of this talk is also, women writers you've never heard about. So maybe let's ask the question, if you could talk a little bit about the what and who of the 3 classicists of Yiddish literature.
So the 3 classicists are always regarded correctly, I think, as Mendel Amochasfarim, Shin Yud Abramovich, Shalom Aleichem, and Yud Lamed Peretz, Ayel Peretz, right? And they've been canonized in the same way that Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Milton have been canonized in English. And when I was doing this research, I came across a number of women who wrote at the same time and were published at the same time. They weren't as prolific, but they were certainly there. And I began to wonder what it does if I had taught a course on the classics in modernity where I taught the 3 men, and I want to teach, I will teach a course that continues to say the classics in modernity, but that includes people like names really very few people have heard of: Bas Malke, Rachel Breches, Salome Perl, Isabella. I translated one of her short stories a while ago. And if you include those, it raises the question of what is the experience of the Haskalah, of the Enlightenment, if you look at it from a woman's point of view. What is the experience of entering the modern world? What does modern mean? for women as well as for men. Does it mean the same thing? It's unlikely that it means exactly the same thing. And I think it's really interesting to, I guess, shake that up a bit. I mean, I come from a generation, and I'm sure that, you know, at least half of the people on this webinar will be nodding their heads if they know Yiddish, from a generation that had no women on any syllabi or any reading list that had to do with Yiddish literature, or had, you know, two at most. And that wasn't only my experience. So I think, just, as I said, shaking that up a bit changes both our sense of Yiddish literary history and of what modern means, and what we might be looking at.
So I know of the Ezra Corman anthology, which was significant. And then I skip forward, and I'm no scholar, as we will acknowledge, to DeFroyen Conference in the 90s, the publication of Found Treasures, Arguing the Storm, and some of the other earlier translation anthologies. And I want to come back to anthologies with you later in this conversation. You know, those help to build awareness of women's writers. And also, may I ask, did it help to also sort of isolate them as well?
Yes, in the most literal sense. That is, if you have a book devoted to 500 years of, I'm talking about Corman's now, 500 years of women's poetry, you have set them apart from the book that would include 500 years of men's poetry. But it was done, all of these works, I think, played a really important role, as you say, to build awareness. And they played an important role at a particular time that we haven't gotten past yet. I hoped for a long time that, you know, these kinds of, all of the ones that you've mentioned, would eventually not be necessary, right? That I could, without protesting, teach a course on the classics that included those other names that I have mentioned, and that women would become as normalized in the Yiddish literary canon as men have been. And to some extent that's happened, and it's continuing to happen. But I'm not yet past the point where I want to draw special attention to what some of the women have written. And as you know, that's particularly true for me about prose writing, and long form novels, even novellas that women wrote, because they were said not to have done it.
Interesting. So this segues into my next question for
you,
which is, you know, again, I look at my understanding, you know, when I first came to the Yiddish Book Center and began to learn all about this, I thought of women, you know, Yiddish women writers as poets primarily, but have come to find out that they did write novels, and they were journalists. They wrote nonfiction, they wrote plays. I'm fascinated by the fact that this is all beginning to surface, and probably more within the last 10 years, safe to say, but, you know, there's been work going on for a long time. And what are your thoughts about that in terms of scholarship that's going on, in terms of translation, and just in terms of giving some purchase to the work of these women in all of these genres?
What are my thoughts about? My thoughts are that it's really a good thing that's happening. Yeah. I have no problem with any of that. All right. I'd say that the last 20 years has seen a real surge. I mean, there are, what shall I call them? The forerunners of what we're seeing, as you say, in the last 10 years, who were enormously important to this field. Irena Klepfish, Norma Fain Pratt, Frida Foreman. The problem with naming names is that you leave names out and insult people. So I apologize in advance if I inadvertently, I mean, I know I've left out a lot of names, but at least Irena Klepfish used to say that what they did in presenting these women writers was sort of like written on water. That is, it just disappeared. I don't think we would say that anymore. I mean, we're all very much beholden to these researchers and to these translators. But if you look, I mean, anybody can look on your website, on the Yiddish Book Center website for translations, and you'll see that the last 20 years has been like nothing before.
White Goat Press, I think this year we have 5 books coming out by women writers of all different genres, which is really exciting, including your novel, Celia
Not my novel.
Not your
Celia
novel, but
Dropkin's novel.
the novel that you translated, Celia Dropkin's Two Feelings. So, a couple of months ago, however long ago it was, I mentioned Defroyan, which was in the 90s, and you were part of that. Irina Klepfish was part of that, Catherine Hellerstein, and on from there. And all of you did really groundbreaking work in bringing women to the forefront. So we held this weekend program here, and it was interesting because you see, and I think it's fairly safe to say 3 to 4 generations now who are all engaging. And I'd like to ask if you could reflect a little bit on that, and again, in what has been opened up to another generation as they begin to explore women writers and put them out there in translation and in scholarship, et cetera.
I've had, well, not many people, but within the English, I was in the English department at Michigan for all those years. And my English colleagues couldn't believe that there were writers. I mean, they were a little incredulous when I said, I'm finding all of these women who wrote novels that, people haven't written about. How does that happen? What would be the question that came back? I don't think that it is possible for a student of Yiddish literature now to get a list, as I did, of 100 works, not one of which was written by a woman. I don't think that would happen now. So that change is certainly dramatic. And because the earlier work, well, I think the earlier work is still continuing, because the first stage of understanding what women are doing in Yiddish literature, or what Yiddish literature itself has done, or has been done with it, the first order is to find them, as as many people here know, I resist the term discover. I did not discover Chana Blankshteyn. She was very well known in her own time and was very much not known after her own time. So it's really recovering is the language that all of us who have been doing this work have been using, I think, quite correctly. So since a portion of this at least has been recovered, it leaves those of us who are still active and those who are younger, it leaves us freer to ask different kinds of questions. Not, who's there? I mean, what's there? But rather, what's it doing? Mm-hmm. How do we interpret it? How do we understand it? Which I think are actually, I mean, I love doing the archival work, but I think those are important questions, the other ones, the newer ones.
I found it really interesting. Miriam Haya Siegel, who is here, librarian at the Dorrit in New York at the New York Public Library, somebody we work with a lot, has been putting together this incredible spreadsheet. What is she up to? Like 800 plus names.
Yeah.
Women. And then also anecdotally, can you tell the story about how you began to look for women writers? I love this. Yeah.
As I said, I didn't quite believe that there weren't any. But when I moved back to New York, I had an NEH grant to do something. And the something that I had proposed was to sit in the Center for Jewish History and look for women. Not women sitting in the Center for Jewish History, but look for names of girls So I started because because I had already translated the Kadya Molodovsky novel. I knew that there were poets who had written novels. So I started with the poets that I knew, and began looking for their work, and was surprised because they weren't on any list, to find that Celia Dropkin had written a novel, Rochelle Verprinsky had written a novel, which I'm working on now. So that was the first stage. And then I say this to students all the time, you can only do this when you have tenure, or a full professor or retired. I went looking for names of girls. So I looked up in bibliographies, in the Yiddish lexicon, in card catalogs, which the YIVO still has a wonderful one of, as well as a digital one. And I looked for names of girls, Hannah, Sarah, Rivka, Leah, and then I looked up to see what, I looked them up to see what they had written, and made a list based on that. And the reason I say you can only do this at a certain stage in one's career is because I didn't know if a book would come out of this. And I have to confess that had I been at an earlier stage of my own career, I wouldn't have taken the risk of doing a year's worth of research, not knowing if a book was coming out of it. So that's both true confession and practical confession.
And it's a luxury in a good way.
Yes. It really was.
The other aspect of this is, and I'll go back and refer to a program you did here, which I talk about a lot. You did a weekend program on women poets.
Many years ago.
And, I'll confess, I'm not a poetry person, but I went because I wanted the benefit of learning about who these women writers were. And it was fascinating. You read a lot in translation. Thank you. And the voices of these women were contemporary, if I may. They're strong, they're bold, they take no risks. They were amazing in a way that I don't know that many of the books I've read by male writers are as sort of raw or honest. And I wonder if there's anything you can talk about in terms of some of these women and their resulting work.
I'm not
twisted. It's a twisted question. So, I mean, the voices of these women, I think a lot of people, myself included, are surprised at how contemporary both their voices and the issues that they deal with. Blume Lempel in Oedipus in Brooklyn is dealing with abortion. You have in Two Feelings. I mean, I called you right after I read your manuscript submission, and I just find it fascinating. I'm not going to do a spoiler alert, but there are some really interesting dynamics going on there. And you forget about the time period because you think, oh, this is now. And the poetry that you read at that weekend program was the same. And they were fighting against the tide, as you say, and what's the name of the anthology, sort of arguing the storm.
Arguing the storm.
Yeah, it wasn't easy for them to come to writing. It wasn't easy for them to find an audience in the same way that men found an audience and found publishers. And their work is just so strong.
Their work is very strong. I would rephrase that a little bit, if I might. It's not that they weren't able to get published. I mean, they published much less, partly because there were certain expectations about what women should be writing. And this extended into the criticism. I don't mean just poetry or prose. I mean the kinds of subjects, the critical assumption, certainly in America for way too long, was a kind of mein Yiddische Mann approach to their literature, right? Women write about love, they write about their emotions, they write about their families, they write about those kinds of things. But when I started reading these works, they write about sex. I mean, they're not doing descriptive, pornographic anything. but they're writing about desire. What do I want out of this relationship? Or what's wrong with this relationship? They're writing about all of the things that men are writing about as well. War and revolution and economic depression and displacement, immigration, you name a topic, women have been writing about it. But they have, as I said before, experienced it differently, and the norm was not theirs. I mean, I'm always reluctant to paint a broad brush that says women wrote X while men wrote Y. I know that that's something it's one of the reasons that I haven't, and I don't plan to write a book about women's novels in Yiddish, because I'm also reluctant to sort of categorize them in that strict way. They were as varied as one can imagine or want, and it was important to me. They wrote about affairs. It was important to me to give a fuller view of what they lived in the modern era, which is where I live, and I just found it. I mean, all right, if I can give you one example. There's a book that I'm working on with Ellen Cassidy, who's a well-known translator and a wonderful one, which is a roman clay. It's a novel about the Yiddish poetry group, the Junge, in New York. The Junge, if you ask for a list of the Junge poets, you get men, or the Junge writers, you get mostly men. Well, Rachel Raprinsky was one of them, not one of the men, one of the people associated with the Junge, who was known as a poet and who wrote this novel that I don't want to give too much away of, that we're translating as Weaving Hands, which is basically an autobiographical novel about her relationship, her 30-year relationship with the poet Mani Leib, in which, as was her biographical, was true for her biographically, in which she describes a woman who leaves her husband and child in order to be with her lover, and her lover, Mani Leib, who has a different name in the book, but it's absolutely clear, and Mani Leib, who leaves his wife and 5 children to be with his lover. So, what does it mean in the Dropkin novel, the one that you're now bringing out, hopefully soonish? Soonish. I know this is an ongoing discussion. 2 feelings, right? I think the one thing that I would say, at least about the ones that I am translating by these women, is that they have a kind of psychological depth. And you say rawness, I say honesty, maybe rawness, that is wonderful. People have multiple feelings for different people. How do you deal with that, right? People move, people, have children. People do all the things that people do in these novels, and they're not pasted over with some, they're not nostalgic. I think that's what I'm going at. They're not nostalgic, and some of these are written after the war, when you would expect perhaps more nostalgia.
I think of Hava Rosenfarb, we just came out with her complete
Right.
stories. I mean, whoa, talk about psychological, and talk about just the exploration of feelings. Yeah. It truly is amazing. I wonder, in terms of all the work that's going on, there's a lot going on with translation currently. Can you talk a little bit about, do some of you find one writer and champion that writer? Is it hard to find their voice? Can you flip-flop? I mean, I guess it's unique to each one of you as a translator, how you find your way translating that work.
I translated this one novel by Molodovsky, and then I thought, there's so many more women out there. Let me move on. I'm tempted to go back to her second novel, Someday, which also takes place in America. It also takes place after the war. The first one is during the war. Jessica Kruzane has put Karpilov, Miriam Karpilova on the map. So it really depends. The voice is the most interesting thing, most interesting problem to me as somebody who, is a literary scholar. I have not, I hope, I say this with some hesitation, I have not had problems finding a voice in these stories. I mean, the most difficult one was the Blankshteyn one, because the voice changes, right? Male, female, different ages, different professions, different interests, different desires. But there's something, you struggle with this. You do 8 or 9 or 10 iterations of a translation until it's. I mean, I'm not a romanticist about this, but until it kind of, it's like music, until it sounds right.
And it's hard. I mean, the books that we work on at Wyco Press, we refer to them as literary translations. They're not just a straight, I've got the word right, because the nuances are just, and you could put 5 translators in the same room and argue indefinitely about what the actual word is, correct?
Without question. I mean, the text for this is the myth about how the Septuagint, the first translation of the Bible into Greek, was done, right? They called 70 scholars together. They put them into 70 different rooms, and the 70 came out with the identical translation. And the myth is, the identical translation should always be better than the original. I don't know what that means, but that is, of course, an absurdity. I mean, Writing in Tongues, that book I did before moving on to translation, which was about translation, looked at multiple translations of the same text. So when 15 translators translate Yankiv Gladstein's Good Night World, Gute Nacht Welt, they write different translations. And it's not that some of them are wrong. I used to say nothing's wrong, but some of them just missed or, changed too much. But it's not that the translations are bad, or they're different, and they're different at a different time. There have to be, I don't know how many translations of Don Quixote by now, who, once you've translated it, well, English changes as well as Spanish, or in our case, Yiddish. And I can spend, I mean, I know you know this, I can happily spend a good half hour trying to think about whether this particular character would have said happy or glad, right? Angry, mad, pissed off, if I may. What's the register? I mean, that's both the challenge and the fun of translation, right? What would they have said?
And it's fascinating when I am privy to all of your work to see what you go back and forth with. The other thing that is so interesting to me is that, translation in publishing is catching on in ways that it hadn't 10 years ago. It keeps grabbing more and more of a percentage of the readership each year. And translators are able to work with living writers, and none of you are. And that, I would think there's a responsibility in a way that comes with that. And also just it must, again, be hard to wrestle with. You need to understand who this woman was.
The responsibility, I don't know how to describe this. The responsibility, I feel, for me, is to the text rather than to the writer. Mm-hmm. It is, I'm going to get letters about this. Please don't send them until I'm finished. I want to represent what the writer is saying, in the tone in which she's saying it, in the register that she's using. That's all important. But for me, it's within the text. There's another, and I say this because another concern about women's literature is that it is often interpreted as autobiographical. I hesitated before deciding to do the Vaprinsky autobiographical novel, because women write about themselves because that's what they know. I mean, that's a nonsensical argument, but it is an argument that has been made. And I was very clear, at least in the introduction, to distinguish Kadya Molodovsky from her character Rivka Zilberg, that not everything that women write is about my experience. Every writer writes about their psyche, their experience, that's their material. But if you, I know I've said this, I think, to you before, but if you understand this work as autobiographical, you take away the artistry of writing a novel, right? It's one thing, the artistry and also the imaginative power, right? It's one thing for me to describe my childhood. It's another, I think, to imagine a childhood that is different from mine and yet lives on the page.
So hopping over to another part of this, is the question about, and I don't know how much is known or not known about it or what exploration, how were a lot of these women received by their peers, by other writers? Was there a community of one another that supported each other?
It depends on it depends on the women, obviously. Kadya Molodovsky's every word was discussed, her poetry, not as much as the novel I translated and less with the other novels, but nonetheless. These women were known in their time and they were reviewed in their time. I don't know how widespread their work was. They did support one another. I don't mean financially. I mean, there's some wonderful work being done now on letters between these women. That's really, really interesting. So they supported one another. They wrote about one another, and they wrote responses to the men who were writing what they thought were, idiotic things about women, right? The famous one is an essay by Melechowicz, in which he says, women never wrote good poetry. They're not writing good poetry now, and they will never write good poetry because they're not as rooted in the whatever. And Kadya Molodovsky and Malka Heifetz Tussman and others wrote a very clear attack on that attack, right? Don't be a prophet. Don't tell me what's going to happen, with the next generation of poets or what's happening now. So there was a good deal of pushback against what, again, Molodovsky's always my touchstone. What Molodovsky objected to as putting women into an Ezrat Nashim, an Ezos Noshim, a women's place in the synagogue, upstairs behind the balcony. That's not where we belong. And that goes back to that question you asked way at the beginning, right? Does it build awareness or does it isolate them? And it's a back and forth all the time. A lot of these women didn't want to be known as dichterins, as poetesses, for obvious reasons, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the two things that you mentioned are the two works in translation that I would love to do, which is come out with all of these letters back and forth. I mean, the letters that We have a Hava Rosenfeld between Hava and Blume Lempel finding one another are great. And then
Right.
again, some of the quotes that push back at some of the unbelievable things that were said. Like,
So
yeah.
I don't know if this is, advertising the wrong things, but Faith Jones and David Mazower and I are about to publish something in Pakenträger that where we've translated some of these comments about women and women's comments in response. Just handpicked a handful. But I think it begins, and we're hoping other people will add to this, that it will become an archive of this material. Bogavich essays translated there, and Molodovsky's response, and other really interesting things to begin to give a sense of this back and forth, and sometimes this pushback.
So I'm going to circle back a little bit, and as we're winding down to getting to questions, there was a New York Times article several months ago by Joseph Berger, and there's a quote saying by you, "This literature has been hiding in plain sight, but we all assumed it wasn't there. Novels were written by men while women wrote poetry or memoirs and diaries, but didn't have access to the broad worldview that men did. If you've always heard that women didn't write novels in Yiddish, why go looking for it?" Speak a little bit about this in terms of Dropkin and the rest of your work.
Look, again, in this is also true confessions. When I got that list of 100 works I had to know before I could begin to think of myself as knowing anything about Yiddish, and there wasn't a woman on it, I actually never questioned that for years, maybe even for decades, right? Because again, if there's an authoritative voice that tells you what is there in the literature, why go looking for something else? Somebody's done this work, but no, somebody hasn't done this work. All of the people, I don't want to paint with such a broad brush, but the sense that women didn't write novels, or that they wrote domestic novels, right? Novels about the home, is not based on reading these novels. It's based on another kind of assumption. So again, if you think you know what's there, why go looking for it? But what I said before about discovery, recovery rather than discovery, every time somebody says, well, you discovered that book, it's really interesting, my response is always, Columbus discovered America, right? I mean,
it's my thing with the revival versus what I think of as continuum.
Right, exactly.
Before we open it up to questions quickly, I know you've touched a little bit about what you're working on. Do you want to share any more of?
So Dropkin, as you say, is coming out soonish, yes. 2 Feelings. I'm translating with Ellen Cassidy that book by Rachel Verpinsky, The Roman Clay. I am actually translating a man. Hold on to your seats. I'm general editor of this collection that's coming out from Corin Publishers, the collected works of I.J. Singer in English. And it turns out that more than half of his stories have never been translated. And I have a commission. I mean, somebody's actually paying me to translate. It's very exciting. I'm translating 20 or so of those short stories for this collected works. So it's taking me a little bit away from these women, but there are lots more to come, not just by me, but by all the women and men who have been working on this for the last 20 years and more.
And for those who are out there, your book is forthcoming. We will announce the release date fairly soon. And you can go to whitegopress.org to learn more about that and get on the list so that you can get a copy as soon as it comes out. Two Feelings, the translation of Celia Dropkin's novel. Anita, before we open the questions, I just want to thank you for everything, the groundwork that you've laid, and for your ongoing work. I mean, you're sort of just, it keeps rolling out in new and exciting ways. It's always fun to talk to you.
I'm having fun.
Next time we get to do it over drinks, please. So Suzanne, do you want to come back on and shoot some questions our way?
Yep. Thank you both very much for that wonderful conversation. Lots of questions here, so we'll do our best to get to them all. Someone wanted to know, did any of the women writers use male pseudonyms? Sorry, I cannot pronounce the word. Yes.
That's a great question, because it's exactly the opposite that is true. That is, whoever's asking this question is thinking of, no doubt, George Eliot, George Sand. In Yiddish, men sometimes took women's names as pseudonyms for a number of reasons. They were writing what in Yiddish is called shund, trashy novels, dime novels. And they assumed that the readers of novels were women and would respond more favorably to a woman writing. So they took women's pseudonyms. The other example of this is two very famous and now, very famous among our circles, poets, American poets, Yankiv Gladstein and Halpern, who took women's names when their first poems were rejected, and they sent it, because women write poetry and they write a certain kind of poetry, and they took on a woman's name in early years. But pseudonyms are fascinating, all through Jewish history, and not just in Yiddish. The pseudonyms were always used.
Thank you
these
very much.
ones, but I love this switch from women taking on men's pseudonyms and men's names, and to men taking on women's.
Do we know at all if some of these women wrote books and stories in the language from their country, and how do we rediscover them?
Recover them. The short answer is absolutely. And some of this is known, and some of this requires knowing Polish, Russian, Ukrainian, the languages that were their home languages. There are, there's one or two who wrote novels in English once they came to America. But this is another fascinating, important issue. Women were better educated in foreign languages. It was not entirely true, but most often true, that it was women who translated from European languages into Yiddish. Right. And this gave them a kind of opening to the literatures of the world that they gave to Yiddish readers. So I've lost track of the question, but it was.
Are there books that these women have written in their native tongue?
Yes, we know of a number of poets like that, and in fact, when they wrote works in these other languages, they were often accused of worshiping foreign gods, right? I mean, not literally, but right, of looking for inspiration outside of the Jewish community, as opposed to what I think we would say now, and some people said even then, they had a broader sense of world literatures because they read them and they translated them. And they were open to them in a different way. I mean, if the religious world is closed to you in a certain way, the literary cultural world is not. So yes, they wrote in their native languages.
Are any of these books still available to read in Yiddish for those who want to?
Well, Lisa's smiling, because the Yiddish Book Center has done, I don't even know how to begin to praise this project. They have put Yiddish literature, they have digitized Yiddish literature. It's available for free. I can now teach works that I could never have taught I don't know how many years ago. I can translate works I could never have translated because they've been digitized and I can see them. Yes, they are. I mean, and they also have, hardcover books that you can actually purchase for very little on their website. So yes.
Lisa, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, it's always been our mission, having recovered over 1 million books. There are probably 40,000 or so unique titles. We've got 12,000 available for free. The idea is to redistribute them and get them in the hands of other readers. It's been an enormous resource, I think, in having people recover some of this literature and find works that we never knew existed in digital format. And I'm also excited to announce that we are working on the Universal Yiddish Library, which brings together our holdings, the holdings of YIVO, the National Library of Israel, and others, so that we have a fully accessible literature, all available digitally. And that project is in the works. You can find out more about it on our website. But the idea is, again, Yiddish will be the a fully available digitized literature, the only one. So we're excited about that.
Were any of these works banned?
Banned? You mean
right? Today, the controversy of banning books. Did it happen then as well?
It happened to Chana Blankshteyn with a play, but not that I know of. I don't know how we would know that, since if they were banned, they wouldn't have appeared. But I don't know, exchanges among writers or letters to the editor complaining about banned books.
Mm-hmm. Were husbands supportive of their wives that were writers? Do we know this?
We do know this. In fact, it has been said, not by me, and not by any of the people I've named, and not by anybody I will name, that women came into Yiddish literature because their husbands or fathers or brothers convinced them to write in Yiddish. Now, I'm saying this because I don't believe it. They were writing for an audience that spoke Yiddish, and every Yiddish writer began in another language. Nobody had only Yiddish as their language. So the question was, why did you turn to Yiddish? And the answer is always because that's what people read, because that's how I could reach the masses of the Jewish public. That were my masses. I'm not dismissing Ladino or other Jewish languages, but I'm talking about a certain population. I mean, that's the story about it. That it is true, however, to be perfectly fair about this, that men were the editors of journals. Not always, but almost always. I mean, I can count on one, mutilated hand how many women got to edit a literary journal or anything like that, as opposed to editing the women's pages of newspapers or journals. So men were the editors and the publishers, and often they published their own family members. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that they brought their relatives into Yiddish writing, that they convinced them to write in Yiddish.
That actually goes to another question someone asked, if there were editors of these women's work, or was that more of a new thing in publishing in recent times?
That's also an interesting question. And there it really depends on the publication. As everybody knows, most people know, if you were published in the Vorwärts, in the Yiddish Daily New York newspaper, one of them, you were edited by Khan, sometimes ruthlessly. I mean, I've seen letters where Khan, there wasn't an editor, there wasn't a copy editor in the sense in which we use it, right? No, don't use this word, that is in the wrong place. Almost all of Yiddish literature was serialized, and it went quickly. There wasn't often, somebody who would correct things. And a lot of it is repetitious because of serialization and because, if you're writing something over a year's time and you don't go back to change the first chapter, you may make a mistake by the time you get, or you may change your mind by the time you get to the last chapter. So there wasn't that kind of editing, but editors thought that they knew what women would read. And in that sense, they chose what to publish.
For those that were writing these serialized works, did they have a whole book and then the forward wanted them to cut it into weekly bits, or they just wrote as they went along?
Yes, that is both. We have stories of both of those. My first book was about I.J. Singer, and there's a letter from Ab Khan. He was Singer was sending in, regular installments, and there's a letter from Ab Khan saying, "I really don't like this ending. You've planned out this ending that's just too kitschy for me." And Singer wrote back a really irate, letter, as you can imagine. What I have found most often is that there's no rhyme or reason to where a piece of a novel stops. And it's very clear to me that it stops when there's no more space for it. So it can stop not at the end of a chapter or even at the end of a exchange. It can stop at the end of a paragraph, at the end of, there's a conversation. I say my part, and then I have to wait for tomorrow to hear your part because there was no room for that extra line.
The cliffhanger.
Sometimes it's a cliffhanger. It's most often just, okay, that's it.
Someone would like to know what was most valuable in your background, education, and preparation that gave you the tools to give voice to these women. They said, "I see you as pulling these women voices forward in time, which is an amazing task."
Thank you for that question. The most important thing for me was being raised in a Yiddish-speaking household. Yiddish was my first language. I wasn't born here. Yiddish was my first language. My parents were Polish Jews, not religious, secular, lefty, that crowd as opposed to the religious crowd. So I spoke Yiddish exclusively until I went to kindergarten, which is when we came to the States. So that certainly was the most important. And I think of myself as not as, what was the phrase? Pulling these women. What was the phrase you said? Pulling these women into the I don't have the well, it was something about pulling these women into the contemporary age or into the modern period. And I think they were writing. I mean, I'm perhaps at most I would say that I and others are making visible how much they belong in the modern age, in the contemporary world. This is something that Lisa said earlier, how she reads these and she thinks this could have been written now. Right. And, that's how great literature works. It lives outside of its own moment. Sorry, I saw the moment behind you. I didn't mean that as a pun.
Was there anything that surprised you when you started doing this work that you've learned as you've moved forward?
Yes, several things. And maybe this is my own, prior ignorance. I was surprised by how many women there were writing prose. I mean, I only deal in prose because I wouldn't dare translate poetry because it would be a mess. How many there were who wrote prose, novels, and longer, long form fiction, prose, and how early they began. Right, at the beginning, I think it was the first or second question when I said, let's put these women, Bas Malka, Rachel Brachas, etc., let's put them in the same conversation as Mendele and Sholem Aleichem, right? What happens then? So I was surprised at how early. I'd always thought women started writing when they got to America or when they, at least the 20th century, but it's earlier. And and how frank they were about what they wanted and needed. They're frank about abortion. But that was a surprise about how many. I mean, I figured, somebody's going to talk about this, but how many are talking about that? How many are talking about what they need from the men in their lives, or why they don't want the men in their lives? And that was based, because of my own naivete, that was eye-opening.
Mm-hmm. And aside from the two books that you translated, are there other women writers that you suggest people take a look at to start?
Are you kidding? Well, there's now here. I'm really not going to name names because I will get into serious trouble. If you look up what's been translated, I think there is a wealth there that people should start reading more seriously. I mean, as I said before, Miriam has been translated, Blume Lempel has been translated, Shira Gorshman is about to come out. There are writers literally all over the world, Yiddish writers all over the world, who have been published. Ida Mays, I keep coming up with more names. Esther Singer-Keitman, the sister of IJ and IB Singer. These are all very much worth reading. They're more worth reading in Yiddish, but if you can't do the Yiddish, it's okay to read them in the English, which is why I'm spending the rest of my, thinking life trying to render them into English.
We have to start to wrap up, but can you quickly talk about, you said how you could spend time thinking about, should you use the word happy versus ecstatic? How do you really go about that till you find that right word? Because some things just, I would think, don't translate well.
Some things don't translate well. How do you find the right word? I don't want to make this into some kind of mystical experience. It comes to me in the middle of the night, although that has been known to happen. But as I said, it's 8 or 10 revisions and revisions until. So let me just give you one very quick short example from the Molodovsky book. She makes a play on words early on. It's about a refugee, and she makes a play on words between Flüchtling and verflucht. That is, in refugee and cursed. Now, Flüchtling and verflucht has a rhythm. It sounds very different from translating that as what a horrible word refugee is. It means cursed. What do you do with that? But I did that for 5 or 6 versions of this, and then I don't know why. What goes well with refugee is refuse, right? Refugee is a horrible word. It must come from the word refuse. It's like being cursed, right? You have to do a little explanation there, but you need the rhythm. And sometimes that comes, sometimes it doesn't come. I'm sure I've missed very many of them. That one sticks out because it worked. And I was ecstatic when it worked.
Great. And lastly, is there something that these, I'm sorry, what can we learn from these women today? As you were saying before, and Lisa was saying how when you read it, it can feel so relevant. What's a takeaway that people can leave with?
I guess I would turn that question back into, what can you learn from women today? It would be the same answer. I don't know how to answer that. I don't know how to answer that other than to say it's what you can learn from women today. Great.
Well, I encourage everybody to go to the Yiddish Book Center's website, which I put in the chat, to see all of the books that they have available. I want to thank Anita and Lisa for joining us for this wonderful conversation today. I'll be sending out a follow-up email that will include the links to the books that Anita has translated, as well as to the to the White Goat Press website, which is part of the Yiddish Book Center's website. And I encourage everybody to go to momentmag.com, where you can sign up for next week's program about a conversation about Israel with journalist Isabel Kirshner. Again, thank you everybody for joining us. Lisa, actually, do you want to say anything else about Yiddish Book Center before we go that hasn't been said yet?
No, I think we're all good. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.